43% of first marriages end in divorce. Now, normally people get better at something the more often they do it, but that's not the case when it comes to marriage, because the divorce rate for second marriages is 60% and 73% for third marriages. So you have a 50-50 chance that your relationship will end. Let me ask you, if there was a 50% chance that you'd get struck by lightning every time you left your house, would you do that? I wouldn't. And the amount of people entering relationships blindly is astonishing, considering that 70% of couples don't fully grasp what marriage really involves before getting married. So before you get on a knee or become chemically driven to make a lifelong decision, these are 14 signs that somebody's meant for you or not. Let's get into it. And this brings me to my first point: conflicting core values. One of the often overlooked elements of anything that drives positive outcomes are the intrinsic drivers or motivators as to why we do what we do, aka values. Marriage is a long ride, and if you're on different tracks with your own core values, you'll eventually derail. Imagine you're planting a tree together, and while one of you waters it patiently, the other one dumps fast-acting fertilizer on top. Well, what happens? The roots become weak. Core values, things like family, religion, and ethics, are the roots of your relationship. And if you don't align here, your foundation will crumble. And the evidence supports this. 53% of divorced couples cite differences in their core values as the primary reason. Now, the other thing that we have to address in each of these points is the difference in how men and women might think about these things. From the male perspective, well, many men will prioritize career success, financial stability, and personal freedom. And they might assume that their partner shares these priorities, or feels incredibly frustrated when these values aren't mirrored. So if you're working your ass off to make sure that you guys have assets and resources while she's whimsical about it all, and the responsibilities that come with that, well, it might feel like your efforts are completely sabotaged, and this over time will lead to resentment. It's also important to note that men need to honor these values more than how attractive they might come off, aka don't contort yourself to please or impress, or avoid conflict when you have something to say. And certainly don't posture to be somebody that you're not, just to gain affection, validation, or admiration short term. Because you being you and owning all of you, well, that's one of the best embodiments of masculinity. Now, from the female perspective, women often place more emphasis on family and relationships. This can drive their desire for emotional intimacy and shared life goals with you. And when these goals are overlooked, they might feel unsupported or undervalued. And if all she wants is your time and attention, and you're focused on building and creating something, she will likely feel neglected and unappreciated, which can ultimately lead to, well, undesired outcomes. So how do we go about preventing this? First, make sure you have early conversations around values. Cover topics like children, finances, and your long-term goals. It's also important to understand that people will grow and evolve throughout a relationship. Who you were 5 years ago likely isn't who you are today. So you want to make sure that you check in regularly on these things. As life evolves, so will your values. And make sure you regularly ask, are we still aligned on this? The other important thing to note is that compromise is essential when it comes to lifelong partnerships. So identify the most important values and make sure that you find common ground, not just in what they are, but how you live them. And this is where it's important where if you do disagree, you prioritize understanding over winning. Now, that being said, if you do have a red line in a relationship, which you should, it's okay to uphold your boundaries. And that doesn't make you demanding or toxic or even controlling. If you're saying, that's okay, but I don't align with that, or that doesn't align with what I want long term, it doesn't make you toxic, it makes you convicted. And this leads me nicely into my next point: unrealistic expectations. Marriage isn't a Hollywood romance. It's more like a DIY IKEA project, where the instructions are missing and you're just kind of hoping it doesn't collapse. When expectations about love, sex, responsibility are unrealistic, disappointment is inevitable. And people who expect perfection, well, they often end up frustrated. And studies show that 45% of couples who divorced within the first 10 years had listed unmet expectations as a major factor in that decision. And from the male perspective, some men may feel like a relationship should be pretty easygoing. And on top of that, just assume that love will smooth over any bumpy roads. So when conflict arises, they may completely withdraw, feeling like the relationship should be less work, or it's always something from their partner. And from the female perspective, well, many women tend to have this fairy tale expectation, what the right guy would simply just know that they needed, and exactly what to do at any given moment. This also creates an image of what intimacy or emotional closeness should be like with the right guy. So when reality doesn't meet these ideals, they might feel unfulfilled, blame themselves, or completely write off their partner because the right one would just know what to do. And this is often why, as a side note, if he wanted to, he would. The math doesn't math here, especially if the communication of what you actually want is never given. So in order to address this stuff head on, here's what you need to do. 1, communicate expectations. Be honest about exactly what it is that you expect, and be willing to compromise where you both may need to adjust. For example, if you expect a man to provide for you, then you need to own that, and also acknowledge the role that you need to play in order to support that. Alternatively, if you expect to maintain autonomy in decision making, then you need to be clear on that up front because it won't feel very collaborative. And while these are really uncomfortable conversations short term, they will alleviate long-term dysfunction. As a side note, it's also important to look at how you perceive things like this. If you can see challenges as an opportunity for you both to grow in a relationship, not that something's wrong with you, your desires, or your ability to navigate, this will lead to much more positive outcomes and a much better understanding of what you both are doing in this relationship and ultimately where you're going. Now, this doesn't also mean that there are no feelings involved in any of this, but it does mean that maybe some of the feelings that you bring into this conversation have more to do with your past history than they do with what's going on right now. And your history does play a role in how your future relationships will play out, but don't worry, I'll get to that in a little bit. Lastly, instead of holding out for grand gestures, make sure you celebrate the little wins along the way. The majority of marriage will be the day-to-day mundane things that you both do repeatedly together. And if you can't find gratitude for the small things, then you will absolutely experience dissatisfaction. As an alternative approach, I would recommend that you shift the idea from expectations to agreements. This leaves less room for disappointment while also shrinking the pool for decision making. And this also brings sovereignty and free choice for both parties to choose. Which brings me to my next point. We have to talk a little bit about emotional intimacy. I don't know if you've ever had this experience, but you could be in the same room with your partner and feel worlds apart. And if you're the only one who cares about connection, it can feel like pushing a boulder uphill, insufferable. When emotional intimacy fades, the relationship gets stuck in the busyness of life, and your partner's presence can be overlooked or taken for granted along the way. And it's important for you to check in not just physically, but emotionally. And this isn't just my opinion. Research shows that couples who fail to check in emotionally are 2.5 times more likely to get a divorce. So this isn't something that's just trivial. And from the male perspective, well, we need to talk about this because they tend to struggle with emotional vulnerability, especially after a history of toxic women potentially weaponizing it against them. And they can see this as a complete weakness or entirely unnecessary. Men tend to often show love through actions rather than using their words. And this can lead to a lot of misunderstanding, especially if your partner requires words of affirmation in order to feel, well, loved. The key in this for men is composure. There has to be a middle ground. I'm not asking you or telling you to be a whiny frickin' wimp, but it's also important that you don't become an emotionless statue. And over time, men tend to fail this test over and over and over again. And women can lose trust that he means what he says or even stands firm in his convictions. And from the female perspective, because women tend to crave affirmation and validation in order to feel emotionally close to their partner, when their emotional needs aren't met, they may become distant, feeling unappreciated. And this can cause friction or lead to conflict, especially in other domains of the relationship. And this only leads to further frustrations that continue to be built up over time. So in order to avoid this growing like a cancer that you don't really notice until it's too late, I would recommend that you create spaces to connect with your partner and actually talk about this stuff. Set aside time for open and non-judgmental conversations where both of you can share what you're thinking and how you feel. When we look at the data, couples want to aim for about 90 minutes a week where they spend that time intentionally connecting with one another, talking about where they're at and where they want to go in their relationship. Alternatively, I would recommend that you take the time to learn each other's love language because they tend to be very different. It's also important to note that we tend to love other people the way that we want to be loved. And as a side note to women, be patient on the vulnerability front. Men may take a little bit longer to open up emotionally. So patience, gentle encouragement, and actually not using that for later leverage is important. So if you say you're not going to weaponize these things, don't, no matter how frustrated or angry you get. Because if somebody is trusting you with their inner world, much like you would want them to hold your internal world sacred, you owe them the same level of respect. Not only is it important if you want this to last, but the alternative is manipulative and can become incredibly toxic. So tactically for women, especially if you want your partner to open up, leading with the understanding that most men have been rode hard and put away wet when it comes to being vulnerable with any woman Understanding and honoring the fact that they can choose here, but that it's safe and that you wouldn't do that is important to communicate to them. And this goes back to my initial point around agreements, which ultimately will lead you to building a foundation of trust. Now, on the back of discomfort, we have to talk about something that makes most people's skin crawl, and that would be finances. You might think marriage is all about love until money shows up as the uninvited guest. Whether it's overspending or secret saving, lack of financial trust will lead to resentment. Think of it like a car engine. If one part isn't working, the whole car will break down. And while it's easy to overlook really uncomfortable conversations, avoiding it is like avoiding changing your oil, which can lead to life-altering outcomes. And if you didn't know this, financial disagreements are the #1 reason for divorces. From the male perspective, men often feel pressured to be the financial provider in the relationship, which can lead to a lot of stress if their partner spends or thinks about money a lot differently. And they also may view financial independence as a sign of their personal success. So it's important to understand what it means to them and what role they're going to play. From the female perspective, they might see finances as a shared responsibility and expect a lot of transparency or entitlement. So if there's financial secrecy or poor money management, they might feel insecure about the future or experience a lot of stress due to fears of instability. The core needs of most women will be around security, and as men are much more risk tolerant, it's important to get clear on what money means to each of you and your relationship with it. So from a tactical lens, what should you do about this? 1, sit down and review your finances together and create a joint plan with how you're going to be able to invest in the things that you guys want to be able to own or experience together in the future. Alternatively, make sure you communicate transparently about your spending habits. And if you need to, agree on spending limits for what you want to be looking at regularly month to month. Importantly to note here, make sure you're clear on what roles you're going to be playing when it comes to your financial health. Traditional roles around money are starting to shift. So it's important to discuss who should handle what and what the agreements will be around that together. The last thing I would encourage you to do is lean into the difficult conversation around what money means to you. This can include your financial situation growing up, what money meant to your family or your experience with it, or how it was even explained to you as a child. This may arguably be one of the most important conversations that you will have with your partner, and it can prevent a ton of distress later on down the road. Which brings me to my next point, especially surrounding difficult conversations, and that's communication skills. If you've ever played a game of telephone, by the time the message reaches the end of the road, it's garbled nonsense. And this is what happens when couples don't know how to communicate effectively. Misunderstandings stack up like Jenga blocks until everything crashes. And communication problems are cited in over 65% of divorces. Now, from the male perspective, it's important to understand that men have a proclivity to be very solution-focused when it comes to problem solving. And this leads them to tend to aim to fix a problem instead of exploring their feelings. Or yours. And this can come off as dismissive to their partners. And when men experience dissatisfaction from their partner, it can lead them to internalize their partner's feelings as their own inadequacy, criticisms of their manhood, competency, trustworthiness, etc. Now, if I could give men a tip for how to navigate this, it's important to be able to develop your own sense of security around being able to receive a woman's feelings, because they will be thrown at you. And if you can do this without internalizing them as if she's saying something directly about you and your character, this will ultimately build reps of trust. And as a side note, women need to hold this same space. Now, from the female perspective, this is probably not news to you, but women love to talk about their feelings and their problems. And oftentimes, they really want their partner to just listen and validate their inner experience without jumping to a conclusion on how we solve this problem. And it's not because they don't want a solution, it's because they also don't like the feeling of being completely invalidated. And if they feel unheard or misunderstood, they're much more likely to emotionally disengage. So, from a tactical lens, here's what you can do. Instead of pointing the finger at your partner and making a ton of assumptions as to why they are or aren't doing something, use I statements and talk about yourself. I feel unheard when, or it really bothers me when. Make sure you focus on you talking about you and not projecting your frustrations onto them. Second, make sure you create space and time to actually have these conversations. When you're both exhausted right before you want to go to bed, probably not the right time to bring up something that happened 3 days ago. It also helps alleviate somebody feeling completely blindsided by your behavior or your frustrations. Alternatively, active listening is a really important skill. When you're in a partnership, you're a team, and you cannot be playing towards the outcome goal if you don't understand the message that you're receiving. What's important to do here is repeat back what you believe that they're saying to you to make sure that you have a full understanding before you provide an alternative perspective. Lastly, especially in a marriage, it's important that you commit to the low road. Asking frequently, how can I best love you, or what do you need right now? When you're in a partnership, it's not about me anymore, it's about we. And if your goal is to reap the benefit of being in a partnership while also being incredibly selfish, then you, my friend, are not ready for a marriage. Which brings me to my next point. Personal growth. You're not the same person that you were when you got married, and neither is your partner. So we can both acknowledge here that growth is somewhat inevitable, but are you growing together? Marriage should be like two people hiking up a mountain, each on their own path, but with a shared goal at the summit. From the male perspective, when it comes to growth, they tend to focus heavily on the external side of growth, meaning career success or physical fitness. And this can often lead them to overlook the importance of emotional growth as well, as this is crucial for a long-term relationship. And this isn't a criticism of men whatsoever. It's more so acknowledging a proclivity. So if they can practice, if nothing else, being a little bit more aware around their comfort in emotions or ability to understand their partners, it's going to help them connect more deeply and help alleviate a lot of frustrations or misunderstandings from both sides. From the female perspective, well, this is not news either, but women tend to prioritize emotional connection and intimacy. And so their proclivity for growth, if any, tends to be oriented towards emotional. And if the male doesn't prioritize emotional or relational growth to the same degree that they do, they may tell themselves that they're outgrowing this relationship, when ultimately their needs just aren't being met. And one thing that women tend to do, because we are much more agreeable than men, is we will hint at things instead of directly shining a light on them, which makes it increasingly more difficult for men to know what exactly they're trying to get at here. So if women can learn to be a little bit more direct, men can better understand how to support them. What's important for you guys to do in a partnership here is encourage your own independent individual growth. If your partner has personal goals, ask about them. Ask how you can support them. Be involved and be supportive. Regularly discuss what each of you are actively working on. And if you can, try to grow together in some way. This allows you to both grow together in tandem towards something you both find value in. What's also important to note is if you're somebody who likes to read books, make sure you implement. Remember that the definition of learning is same environment, new behavior. And so if your behavior doesn't change, regardless of how many books, podcasts, or YouTube videos you watch, then you haven't actually learned anything. Now, another thing I would recommend is something along the lines of mentorship, especially if you are growth-oriented. But just like any industry, there are bad eggs in pretty much any domain you look in. But if you do have the budget and it's a priority to you, I can tell you personally that a great mentor can be life-changing. They help you see your own blind spots because you can't see them, you are you, and give you the tools and skills to grow at a rapidly faster rate. And that is much easier than telling yourself that you can figure it out all on your own. Lastly, get strong, get healthy, and not just for the marriage, but for you. You're going to want to embody the example that your kids will live. So they need to see you active and valuing your health, taking care of yourself, setting boundaries, following through on your commitments, etc. What's also really important to note here, especially around emotions, is having the ability to manage your own state. Many couples feed off of one another and they get so caught up in the go, go, go that they don't actually take the time to check in with where they're at or how they feel. And this is where life can pass you by and you can be across the room from somebody that you barely even know anymore. Or develop vices as coping mechanisms because you don't know how to work through what the hell is going on. And if you end up being somebody who's operating like a robot in the non-stop grind that life inevitably can feel like, life will pass you by before you know it. Months will go by and you'll realize you stopped doing what kindled this flame in the first place. And on the topic of coping mechanisms, this brings me to my next point: unresolved childhood trauma or historical experiences. Marriage often brings out deep-rooted issues from our past. Imagine trying to build a house on land filled with unexploded mines. Childhood trauma, when left unresolved, is like those mines: explosive and damaging. 40% of individuals with unresolved childhood trauma are more likely to experience not only relationship dissatisfaction, but divorce. What's important to note pertaining to this, especially if you're thinking about getting into a marriage, is that you are not just you now, you're you and every version of you you've ever been. Alternatively, so is your partner. This is also why relationships are kind of the rocket fuel for growth. If you allow yourself to view it that way. Because your partner will trigger you, and your willingness to not only acknowledge but communicate that whatever it is that you're experiencing may have absolutely nothing to do directly with your partner, this opens up the door for them to better understand you and support you the next time something like this comes up. And this ultimately alleviates repeated arguments that bring up things from the past. Now, from the male perspective, men may downplay or suppress their past trauma, believing that addressing it could make them appear weak, or just because they're uncomfortable with vulnerability. They tend to be much less feeling-oriented in comparison to their female counterparts. Again, this is not a bad thing, but it can create reactions that jump off of assumptions that were created from past experiences. For example, if a man had a partner who behind closed doors betrayed him by talking negatively of him, and he notices that you exit the room on the phone and hears a comment that out of context feels like you're talking about him, well, he may make an assumption that you again are repeating an old pattern of an ex-partner and going through feelings and emotions of betrayal in that moment, even if that's not what happened whatsoever. From the female perspective, women are much more likely to discuss past trauma. But just because they're willing to talk about it doesn't mean they've actually taken the responsibility or overcome it. And this can lead them to struggle with the lasting effects of it. And this can lead to trust issues, anxiety, and this will inevitably spill over into a relationship. Now, it's important to note a lot of people think that feelings are irrelevant, and maybe, but maybe not. Feelings inevitably are signals, and signals aren't necessarily based in your current reality. And ultimately, these things take you back to where you once were, which can be completely different than where you actually are. And it's important to understand that projecting your past experiences into your present moment only keeps you stuck. And while your partner may exhibit old behaviors that are similar to somebody you once were with that might have been incredibly toxic or caused you a lot of pain, it does not mean that the intentions behind those behaviors are the exact same, or that it's going to lead to the potential outcome that you fear happening. From a tactical perspective, of course, if you have not worked through these things, working with a counselor or a therapist, if you believe in that stuff, can be incredibly helpful. It's important for you as the individual to take responsibility, because even if it wasn't your fault, and most trauma is not anyone's fault, it is inevitably your responsibility if you want to be able to move forward and put that shit down. It's also important to practice patience and understanding. Trauma is certainly not a quick fix kind of thing. So if you're a partner to somebody who's trying to deal through their trauma, aim to be supportive even if you don't completely understand. And on top of understanding, not just that they're going through something that you may not understand because you haven't experienced something similar, but also understand that their reactivity may have absolutely nothing to do with you. And again, circling back to men who tend to internalize women's emotional instability as an attack on their character, it's important for you to really take this on. Now, this may feel trivial or like the past is in the past and it doesn't matter, but I can promise you, what you don't work to heal will repeat. We all have wounds. Even when you think you've overcome them, if you haven't actually faced them head on, they will rear their ugly head at the worst possible moment. And in a long-term relationship, your deepest wounds will be revealed one way or another. So being willing to be open about the way that your life has shaped your perception and ultimately the way you are will not only lead to a greater depth of understanding and deepen your relationship, but it will alternatively help you heal a lot of those wounds so that you not only don't project them onto your partner, but if you plan to have kids, it doesn't get passed down to them. Now, this topic might be a little uncomfortable, but we do have to discuss it, and that would be mismatched sex drives. Sex in marriage is like the fuel to a car. It doesn't make the engine, but without it, the car's not moving. Mismatched sex drives often lead to frustration, feelings of rejection, or even infidelity. Studies show that 15 to 20% of marriages are sexless, which is often a precursor to divorce. From the male perspective, sexual intimacy tends to align with a need, and they may feel rejected if their sexual advances are turned down. And they will equate this to a lack of love or lack of attraction. And from a female perspective, it's important to understand that most women's libido or sexual drive is aligned with their feelings of security and safety. So when the relationship is on shaky ground or they feel like they haven't spent a ton of quality time or connected with you, while their desire to engage in physical intimacy tends to decline. This is not even to mention women aging, hormonal changes, or just feeling emotionally disconnected, which will inevitably happen at some point. So when it comes to solutions, some of these are not so sexy. It may sound unromantic, but scheduling intimacy can be really helpful. And it also ensures that both of you, especially if you live a very busy lifestyle, are still making it a priority. It's also important that you discuss things outside of sexual affection. Sometimes affection without the expectation of sex in the aftermath can relieve some of the pressure and improve overall connection. There's no best way to say this, but the orgasm starts before sex, way before sex. So the more intimate, vulnerable, or open and connected that you aim to be and intentionally create the space for, the more open and fulfilling your sexual intercourse will be. Honesty begets intimacy, simply put. So it's important to take the 5 minutes of time to prioritize connecting with your partner on a regular basis. This could be simply sharing something that you appreciate about your partner, talking about how your day went, share something on your radar that you're nervous or anxious about, share an ask or request for support from your partner to pull them into the experience that you're going through. Now, as a side note on sexual intimacy, I have to note this uncomfortable portion of the conversation. And this might be a point of disagreement between you and I, but nevertheless, it does happen. We've all seen those couples that after being together for a period of time, well, stop taking care of themselves. And as you get into a partnership that you want to be long-term, attraction long-term also matters. And this, in my opinion, is a part of the responsibility that you take on when committing to somebody long-term. So if we flip the script on these milestones, being endpoints, to starting points, well, you would need to build up some endurance to run this race responsibly. Fundamentally, both men and women need to value taking care of themselves and prioritizing their health. And it's not just only great for your health long-term, but also shows that you respect and desire your partner and want to make sure that you, as a representation and extension of them, take care of yourself. Which brings me to my next point. We want to avoid losing ourselves in a relationship. You know how they tell you to put on your oxygen mask first in case of an emergency? The same goes for marriage. Losing yourself in a relationship, whether it's hobbies, connecting with your friends, taking personal time, over enough time, will lead to resentment and ultimately potential burnout. The dreams and passions that you have going into a relationship or the things that you value or spend your personal time engaging with should stay consistent. And from the male perspective, men can feel a lot more pressure when it comes to needing to provide and take care of a woman when she enters his life. And this can cause them to lose sight of their own personal identity and their own personal needs. From the female perspective, women can put a lot of attention and focus, as well as energy, on the nurturing side of the relationship. And they tend to neglect their friendships, relationships, and other parts of their community or personal fulfillment in order to make sure that they are supporting their partner in what they're aiming to build together. It's important for both people to continue to maintain your personal hobbies and ensure that you encourage your partner to have their own independent things. It's also important to note that time apart isn't neglect. It's really important for establishing and maintaining your own personal identities. It's important to note here that men need other men and women need other women. And being surrounded by people in healthy dynamics and healthy relationships, well, is important, especially if you aim to maintain a place of centeredness and wholeness versus doing whatever the latest person on the internet is telling you you need to do to be an alpha male or an empowered female. Now, something else that's inevitable when it comes to long-term relationships that's incredibly important is how you handle conflict. It's not about if you argue, but how you argue. And the goal in an argument in a marriage is that the argument is constructive, not destructive. Now, according to the Gottman Institute, 69% of conflicts in marriage are never resolved. And from the male perspective, they may try to avoid conflict, believing that letting things go will just maintain the peace. However, avoiding conflict or addressing the problem often leaves a lot of these things unresolved. And from the female perspective, especially if the partner is anxiously attached, they'll feel the need to address the issue head on, which can sometimes be perceived as nagging, especially if their counterpart shuts down in conflict. So the best way to go about this is to make sure that you're consciously choosing your battles. Not every issue needs to be a full-on argument. So it's important to focus on resolving the major things and submitting to the relationship when necessary. It's also important to have ground rules for how you argue. Taking breaks when necessary, not allowing negative verbal attacks or assaults. Make sure you're on the same page with how you will handle conflict, especially when emotions are highly elevated. Most importantly, make sure that you're being responsive and not completely reactive. Reacting is very easy and automatic, and maybe outside of your area of awareness, but tends to be associated with a past experience. So it's important for you, if you really want this relationship to work out, give your partner a fighting chance here. This is where it becomes your responsibility to develop levels of awareness where you can feel that temperature gauge getting a little too hot At this point, take a pause. Say, hey, I can feel myself getting really agitated and I don't want to say something I don't mean. So I'm gonna pause and we will circle back and resolve this problem. It's also important to understand that the goal is to understand. That does not mean you have to agree. Ultimately, it comes down to, do you respect your partner's perspective? And can you move forward with some level of compromise? And when it comes to the 70% of conflicts that are never resolved, it's ultimately because what they're arguing about isn't actually the problem. Oftentimes it stems from a need that's not being met, a voice that feels unheard, or a desire that's being neglected or even judged. Most fights are the same fight that was never actually resolved. It just looks different. Which brings me to my next point, life goals. Do you have any idea if you guys are even on the same page about where your life is heading? If you're not, it can ultimately feel like you're playing a game of tug of war. And in order for anybody to move in any direction, well, one will have to outpower the other one. And that, inevitably, is not going to end well. 28% of couples divorce because of a mismatch in life goals, particularly around children, careers, and their overall lifestyles. From the male perspective, they tend to prioritize career and financial success over family and stability, and they assume that the relationship will fit into these goals without much of an adjustment. Now, from a personal perspective, I will say I do believe that a man without a purpose is the most dangerous, not just to him, but to society. So it's important to understand what is your why and what are the things that make you feel whole. From the female perspective, because we're much more emotionally oriented and relationally oriented, we're gonna want to have more clarity around our shared goals. And this is gonna be relevant to children, family, and overall lifestyle. And women, as a consequence, will feel pretty anxious if they don't get a sense that there are some concrete plans. Again, women crave stability and safety, so your communication around these elements of your life are going to be important. And if you do this proactively, this can help alleviate some of her neuroticism. For some tactical steps, make sure that you set some long-term goals. Regularly discuss, where do you see yourselves going? What is your game plan for the next 6 months or even a year? If you want to plan long-term, get into 5 and 10-year goals. But a side note on that, just know that even with a plan, shit happens. It's also important to note here that you guys can be walking different paths. Just make sure that they're headed in the same direction. Having conversations around what you want, especially in terms of family, wealth, and relationships, is going to be really important in your ability to actually co-create that reality together. As I mentioned, it's important to also stay adaptable. As you grow and evolve, get different life experiences together, what you want may ultimately change. But more important than any of that is that you guys choose to grow together and don't end up growing apart. Ultimately, if you want a relationship to last, it's also important to understand it's going to get hard. And if you want to stand the test of time, then you need to be willing to commit without having to go through something hard, aka commit before it gets hard. And on the topic of hard, this is where a lot of couples tend to fall apart. And it comes down to their inability to actually repair. As I mentioned earlier, it's not about if you'll fight, but how you fight. And more than just being respectful to one another in the uncomfortable experience that emotions can bring, the repair after really fucking matters. Couples that dance around or pretend that everything is fine, it's kind of like trying to heal a bullet wound with a band-aid. Not useful and not effective. Couples who cannot repair after arguments accumulate emotional scars. And studies show that couples who regularly repair after conflict are 80% more likely to stay together. Now, from the male perspective, they might feel like once an argument is over, well, there's no point in bringing it back up. Or they get into a point of completely withdrawing, so the conflict is never resolved. A lot of men tend to believe in just moving on and letting it go. But if unresolved emotions linger for their partner, this can come up in many other areas of the relationship. From the female perspective, women might feel the need to rehash arguments in order to achieve their sense of emotional closure. And if they don't get this, well, they tend to hold on to some level of resentment. Now, important to note, as I've alluded to earlier, women tend to be much more agreeable, which means they are not going to be that direct around what they actually want or how they truly feel. And instead, she will continue to poke at this problem or make passive-aggressive comments around what you did or didn't do without actually telling you what she would need from you in order to let this go. Now, as a means of repairing, for women, this is actually a really important point. But oftentimes women are very abrasive to taking responsibility for their behavior and apologizing. But it's ultimately incredibly important for you to know when you've taken a misstep. Men, more than anything, really appreciate when a woman can take ownership. Remember that it takes two, which means somewhere in this, you're playing a role in this conflict. Now, as far as things that you can do proactively, make sure, especially if it gets heated, after you've cooled off, check in with one another and make sure that there are no lingering feelings or things that need to be resolved. It's also important, as I stated, to apologize when necessary, because if there is conflict, both of you are playing a role, especially if it plays out over time. Make the attempt to acknowledge and try to understand the impact that your behavior or words had on your partner, and more importantly, take responsibility for that. It's also really important to acknowledge when you guys do repair in a very healthy way. This will positively reinforce you guys continuing to do that collectively. Lastly, but this is important, mutually emphasize accountability and responsibility. It's not just one or the other all the time. Also remember that sorry doesn't matter if your behavior doesn't actually change. After the repair, you should have learned something as to why that conflict went the way it did, or your role in doing it or triggering your partner, and being more aware of that consciously as you engage in similar arguments down the road will help alleviate the potential downside of you entering an even more detrimental conflict. And this will ultimately allow your partner to feel like they were actually heard and understood as your behavior fundamentally has changed. And this leads me to my next point, ignoring each other's needs. Have you ever tried to keep a plant alive without water? Well, ignoring your partner's needs is the same thing. Whether it's emotional support or affection, when one partner's needs are constantly ignored, it creates resentment and will ultimately build a disconnect. 48% of individuals who had been through a divorce said that unmet needs were a significant factor. From the male perspective, men may assume that if they're fulfilling traditional roles, providing, protecting, that they're meeting all of their partner's needs, not necessarily realizing that emotional connection and support is equally just as vital. Now, speaking to men's needs, men need to feel appreciated for what they do and how they provide, or the things that they go out of their way to do to make their partner's life a lot easier. Thank you isn't a given, and they need to hear it. It doesn't hurt to acknowledge your partner for all of the efforts that they're putting in, or praising them for their accomplishments when they've worked really hard to achieve something. No, this doesn't mean worshiping them. And ultimately, I personally don't think that men receive that many compliments regularly. And men, just like you, or just like their female counterparts, want to feel desired. It's a theme towards men that they're seldomly complimented. And if they do spend time on personal development or physical development, it tends to be the perception that they're conceited or completely self-absorbed. And typically the only compliments that men receive around their physical appearance tend to come from other men. But it lights their world up, truly, when they hear it from the person that they love, as an acknowledgement of the work and responsibility that it takes to do so initially and continue to keep that a value. From the female perspective, women crave connection. It is truly the unlock to a lot of levels of intimacy, and that free-flowing femininity that men often say they want. However, if she feels like there's not a ton of genuine care, or that she's just playing a role, she will likely get into this mode of protection and self-preservation, which ultimately leads to the manifestation of a lot of the masculine energy a lot of modern women tend to have. Sometimes in a situation like this, as far as what to do, is just get right to it. Ask your partner directly, are there any needs that aren't being met here? Or in a situation where you feel like somebody's mannerisms or energy is off, just ask them, what do you need? Or what can I do to support you? What's often really important here is if your partner does express that there's a need that they have that's not being met, is not getting defensive or blaming them for why it's not being met. The responsibility of the relationship comes down to both parties, which means ultimately you can be selfish, but you're putting yourself before the commitment, and that will never last long term. Which brings me to my next point, and this is a really hard thing to accept, but love isn't always enough. Love is like the sun, but the sun enough is not enough to just grow a garden. If you don't have trust, respect, or teamwork, love is not going to be enough to keep your relationship alive. A significant amount of couples, 50% according to this statistic, say they were completely in love with their spouse, but they lacked essential elements like trust and respect. Now, some men may think because they feel love, well, that's enough to make this thing thrive, where they can start to overlook the daily impact of the little gestures that they make that allow their partner to receive that intentional care. Now, from what men need, and this is kind of a personal side note, so men, if you disagree here, let me know. But I have witnessed time and time again that men care much more about a woman's respect than simply her adoration. Now, respecting your partner isn't just about blind submission, but it is listening to, respecting, and upholding the agreements that you made together, while as a female, allowing your partner to lead when it's necessary to do so. From the female perspective, women do tend to recognize that love requires much more than just emotions. Most women just want to know that you're in, that you are willing, able, and committed to do what needs to be done in order to make sure that this relationship is honored, and can thrive. And oftentimes this is why they will poke at you with a million different questions about how you feel and what you want and if you love them and if you're okay, because they want to understand where you are emotionally, which may feel foreign and uncomfortable to most men. But as far as what I would encourage you to do here is make sure that you make intentional effort every single day, even if it's small. The other thing is making sure that you focus on trust and respect. If you have nothing to hide, don't hide shit. And if your partner has set a boundary with you, honor it. A relationship cannot last without those pillars in place. And it's also important, especially for both parties, but it may be women who need this more, is to reaffirm your level of commitment to what you guys are pursuing together. Marriage is the starting line, not the finish line. The reward for pouring into your relationship and one another is not only a depth of love, but meaning and purpose. The level of intimacy and connection can't really be experienced anywhere else. It's also important to note that love is a choice, not a feeling. It's choosing the we, both behind and in front of closed doors. It's honoring your partner no matter the circumstance, temptations, life's changes, or opportunities that come knocking. Again, marriage is a partnership, not a fairy tale. It's not the finish line, but the start of the race. So if you're checking off most of these things that I've mentioned, great, you're heading in the right direction. If not, well, better to figure out now than when you're already in that 50% that's flipping the coin. And if you're interested in thriving relationships while avoiding the animosity that comes with a lack of self-awareness or personal responsibility, then click this video and I'll see you there. If not, fuck off. Bye.